So if you didn't already know, this is a two-part series. This is part one, this is the basics. So we're gonna do a little bit of background about the EHV program. When did it start? Who's it administered by? How does that work? And then we're gonna go through breaking down the emergency housing voucher. So we'll have an example of what an EHV looks like. On the screen, we'll go through the different parts of it. We'll go through, what are unit sizes? What are payment standards? What are utility allowances? What can you expect to pay? What will that be like? And then we're going to have a portion about tenant rights and responsibilities. I know that there are so many different questions with this, going about housing rights, dealing with landlords, neighbors, if you have maintenance or repair problems, lots of questions about that. And then we're going to talk all about recertification, the fun and exciting topics of annual recertifications, interim recertifications, how those differ, and how you can do that on your own. And then we'll end with more of a Q&A. But if you have any questions throughout, feel free to ask those. The second part of the webinar will be focused more about transfers and moving. And so that will have an overview of like how to start that process, how to request a move, initiate a transfer, and then when you have that, how are you going to search? What's the apartment search look like? What's the moving process? So we all know there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of documents, everything going along with that. So we'll talk about all of those options. And I know that in the registration questions, many people had questions about transfers, about porting out. Those will be more focused on the second part of this. We're also hoping to potentially have maybe a broker come in for part of that presentation so we can really have a lot more great resources focused about moving. This presentation will be in January.
Please note, by the way, that the part 2 is January 17th, not January 13th. That's a typo.
Yes, great. Thank you for pointing that out, Sarah. Yes, not January 13th. It will be January 17th. And we will also, information about the second part of the webinar will be sent to your emails since we have that, which is wonderful. So now that we have your emails from the registration, we'll send out more information about the second part as well. And to clarify and reiterate again, this is part 1, understanding your emergency housing voucher. I will be presenting. I am Katie Kopp. I use she, her pronouns. I am an aftercare case manager at Sanctuary for Families. And I am so thrilled to have you all here with us today. Thank you so much for taking this time out of your evening to join us. And yeah, with that.
Sorry, just one more thing I want to add. I want to introduce, if we could, Katie, our other panelists, our other people here, since we have 2 other faces on the screen. Bushra and Tamarata, would you like to introduce yourselves briefly?
Sure. My name is Bushra Hussain. I am a program director over at Sanctuary for Families in our clinical department. So I'm really excited that we're able to have this webinar.
I'm Tamarata Wagir. I'm the program coordinator for housing navigation at the Streetwork Drop-In Center. And I'm here to answer any questions, help where I can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bushra.
Thank you.
Yes, so they'll be manning the chat and helping with questions. And then I'll be giving most of this presentation. So lots of great resources. And I see in the chat that we wish that Mr. Sanchez was here. Don't we all? Raul, we know you're here as a participant and we're glad to have you with that, but you're on medical leave, remember, so take care of yourself. So with that, let's get started. First, I want to start with a little bit of background all about the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. And this, so overview of the EHV program. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that there was a lot going on and caused a lot of significant societal problems, one of which is a housing crisis. And due to this, the Biden administration included measures to address homelessness and housing insecurity in the American Rescue Plan that started in 2021. And this included the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. So whenever we talk about EHVs, that's emergency housing vouchers. And this all started with the federal government American Rescue Plan. And EHVs are tenant-based rental assistance. So this just means that you as a tenant have an EHV. It's not based on the property or whatever apartment that you're in. It's based off of you, the tenant. And it's offered through the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD. So we're going to go through many, many acronyms tonight, and we are just getting started, but HUD, H-U-D, is a federal department. So this is federal government, and they are where all of the funding comes from with the EHVs. And then with all of this, the EHVs are administered by local public housing agencies. So the program for EHVs is federally funded, but it's administered locally. So this means that there are different EHV programs going on all around the country. New York City is not the only place that has emergency housing vouchers, but we are lucky to have a lot of them. And so the public housing agencies in New York City that are administering these vouchers are NYCHA and HPD. Two new acronyms, but these are really, really important ones. And so NYCHA is New York City Housing Authority, and HPD is the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And so in New York City, the only two public housing agencies that distribute and administer emergency housing vouchers are NYCHA or HPD. And another thing that I wanted to talk about briefly on this slide is tenant-based rental assistance. I know that I talked about that this is rental assistance programs that are based on the tenant, and this is similar to Section 8. So Section 8, I know that is a bigger program than EHVs, and so a lot of people think of, when they think of rental assistance programs, you think automatically of Section 8. This is a different program from Section 8, but it operates very similarly. And Section 8 is also, confusingly enough, can be administered by NYCHA or by HPD, and our emergency housing vouchers do follow very similar guidelines, rules, and regulations. But I do want to point out that they are slightly different, but they operate very, very similarly. So now, second part of this, EHV assistance is limited to families and individuals who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, or recently homeless and at high risk of housing instability. So these are the specific portions of the population that the emergency housing voucher program is targeted towards. And if you are here as a voucher holder, that means that you fit one of those categories and had that high priority that allowed you to be able to get your emergency housing voucher. But this is a specific portion of the population, whereas other rental assistance programs might be for different portions of the population. This is what EHV is targeted towards. In the EHV program, I know we talked about earlier, it receives its funding from the federal government through the HUD that we talked about, and this is through the American Rescue Plan, and it received this initial funding for at least 10 years. And I know that this leaves a little bit of an open end, because we're not entirely sure what happens after this 10-year period, because federal politics are a scary question that we cannot tell you exactly what will be happening in 10 years. But this voucher program did receive initial funding for at least 10 years. So if you have your voucher, you have it for 10 years with this funding. It does not, as we know now, continue beyond that 10 years. It may not, we're not sure. But we have this initial funding for 10 years. And now, talking a little bit specific numbers, we know that 7,788 emergency housing vouchers were allotted to NYCHA and HPD. So this means that this is like the number of emergency housing vouchers in New York City. And great question in the chat, is it guaranteed to last the 10 years? And it will, as long as you continue to meet program eligibility requirements. And this is also where the earlier question in the chat of the income limits comes in as well, because there are the specific guidelines the eligibility requirements for this program, and those have to be continuously determined with the recertification process that we'll talk about later. But if you are continuing to meet the program eligibility requirements, it is guaranteed to last the 10 years. Yes. Great. What do we do after 10 years? Great question. Hopefully, there's some changes in the politics and we get continued funding and this keeps going for afterwards. But we cannot say currently what is going to happen after that 10 years. What is the current hope of these programs is that, within these 10 years, there's a lot of, growth in your personal situation, and you're able to have an income that's increasing and at a steady limit, and that the housing market is a less scary place where you're able to not need the tenant-based rental assistance. But as of this right now, we're not exactly sure what will happen after that 10 years. And with income, we're going to talk about that later with recertification. So thanks for asking those questions. Okay. And now, importantly, especially with the question in the chat asking if we don't currently have a voucher, the EHV program has stopped accepting referrals and applications as of September 2022. So this means that no one who is not already on a waiting list for an emergency housing voucher will be able to get a housing voucher with this. New applications are not being accepted. NYCHA and HPD have distributed almost all of the housing vouchers that they have been allotted by the federal government. And so they have additional waiting lists that if there are more vouchers available, they can give vouchers to the people on those waiting lists, but they're not accepting any referrals or applications to add people to those waiting lists. So this means that if someone doesn't have an emergency housing voucher, but they want rental assistance, they will not be able to get it through emergency housing voucher program, but have to go to other tenant-based rental assistance programs. And this is this isn't just New York City, because every different place that was allotted housing vouchers, every different public housing agency that was allotted these housing vouchers is going to have different timelines along which they're distributing their vouchers. Any questions with this? All right. Good. So now we're going to go into breaking down the emergency housing voucher. This is what an emergency housing voucher looks like. And you can see here at the top that it starts that at the top here, it has U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That is the HUD that we were talking about. This is the federal department that runs the EHV program. There's a question. And now looking more at this voucher, there are a lot of different parts of this, and most of these are like generally the same from voucher to voucher, but I want to focus on a few specific parts of the voucher. So starting with voucher number, this is just the number of your specific voucher. So if you have a voucher, you have your voucher number, and when you're communicating with different housing agencies about your voucher and about your case, you'll probably be referring to your voucher number as an identifier in this. Next is your unit size. And the unit size is like the number of bedrooms that has been allotted to your family or your household to have. And so if you're in a studio, that's a unit size of 0 because there's 0 bedrooms. But if you're in a 1-bedroom, your unit size would be 1. If you're in a 2-bedroom, unit size would be 2. We'll go through exactly how those are determined in a later slide. Next are the dates. So the date the housing voucher was issued, the date that it expires, because when you're issued a housing voucher, that means you're searching for housing. We have a certain amount of time, to do this search and to find a place, and then you can get an extension on that date. And so those are the dates that will be here. And then Next, you have the voucher holder, which would be you. If you have an emergency housing voucher, the name, signature, and date that was signed. Here is a really important part. This is the name of the public housing agency. And this is where you find out if your voucher is administered by NYCHA or by HPD. So this sample voucher here that I have up on the screen, this is a NYCHA administered voucher. And then at the bottom, this is the public housing official who administers that. So because it's NYCHA, this is the vice president of NYCHA. Questions? Put them in the chat, please, if there are any on this page.
There's a question in the Q&A. Do the EHV vouchers help individuals get their own home? Which I know that you'll be answering a little bit later. I know in other states have programs like that.
That is a great question. From what I know, no, there's not a household or like a home ownership portion of this. But we can talk more about that later. And that's also something that when we talk about moving in the January second part of the webinar presentation, we'll get more into that. But that is a really great question. Ooh, okay, another great question, I think. It's asking about shopping letters. So when you're initially given for your apartment a shopping letter, that is not just your voucher. There are multiple documents that you're given, but when you're given a shopping letter that yes, so your voucher you're given when you're searching. And then you also have a shopping letter. And the voucher is for while you are searching for an apartment, and then that's like the window. Sorry, let me go back a slide. So that would be this window between your issue date and your expiration date. And so this is, when you're searching, when you have the shopping letter and when you have the voucher. You do still have your emergency housing voucher while you're in an apartment, but that date is going to be after the expiration date, likely when you're actually in the apartment. Does that make sense? The housing voucher and the shopping letter are both for searching. And those are the dates on the voucher. Two separate things. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how unit size is determined. So as you said earlier, unit size is like the number of bedrooms in an apartment. For a studio, 0. For a 1-bedroom apartment, unit size would be 1. And the process for calculating unit size actually differs between NYCHA and HPD administered vouchers. So this is a little bit confusing, but bear with me here. NYCHA is going to be different from this, but starting with HPD, the determination is that there's 1 bedroom per person, with the exception of married or partnered adults who will be allocated 1 shared bedroom. So this means that, say, for example, there's the Smith family. The Smith family is a single mom with 2 daughters and a son. Sorry about this. Smith family is a family of 4. HPD would give this family a unit size of 4. Next, though, NYCHA, much more complicated. So NYCHA has these occupancy standards, and the EHV occupancy standards for NYCHA follow the Section 8 occupancy standards for NYCHA. And these depend on not only the number of household partners and whether there are married or partnered adults in the household, but it also depends on the sex of the household members. So this is adding in a new factor that's going to make things a little more complicated. And if we think about the Smith family with 2 daughters and a son and a single mom, this is a family of 4. So we'll start with the 4 here in the chart. And then we have, that would be 3 persons of the same sex, if we have a mom and 2 daughters, and 1 person of a different sex, if we have the son. And so that would be this bottom thing here, and they would get a unit size of 3. So the Smith family would have, if they had an HPD administered voucher, they'd have a unit size of 4. If they had a NYCHA administered voucher, they'd have a unit size of 3. And so these all, this is different. Like, things differ between NYCHA and HPD. It's confusing. And when you get your voucher administered by either HPD or NYCHA, you don't actually have a say. And like, you can't switch who's administering your voucher. So once you're assigned, you're assigned. There are pros and cons to each, but unfortunately, it is what it is when you get your voucher. But it's important to understand that there are these differences between the 2 public housing agencies. And at any point, if you feel that someone in your family has any medical reason why they might need a different voucher size than would be allotted by your NYCHA HPD occupancy standards, you can submit a reasonable accommodation request. You can also do reasonable accommodation requests for other things as well, but this is one of the most common reasons why people do these reasonable accommodation requests, is because say you're in the NYCHA, the Smith family has a NYCHA administered voucher, they have a unit size of 3, but one of the daughters has a medical condition, meaning that she has to have her own room. And so she can't share a room with her sister. They can't be expected to share a room. Instead, they would need to do a reasonable accommodation request to get a voucher size of 4. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions with this part?
There is a question in the chat that says, how do I get, oh, maybe it was answered. Okay. Okay. Okay, it looks like that was answered. Sorry.
Oh, yes. So I can see the one that the Tamarada is typing an answer now. And that will be something that Tamarada can give you a little bit of an answer now, and that we can also talk about more in January. Okay. Another great question, Joy. How do we request accommodations? So this is, again, a slightly different process with HPD versus with NYCHA. But with NYCHA, you can go in your self-service portal and you can request a reasonable accommodation that way. With HPD, you have to do you have to fill out a form and then send it to an email to request a reasonable accommodation that way. And another great question in the Q&A, how do I ask for special accommodations for phone calls? And this, so if you have a NYCHA administered voucher, this will be in your NYCHA self-service portal. You can request reasonable accommodations in this, versus if you have an HPD administered voucher, you'll have to fill out some forms and paperwork and then email them into HPD. So the processes differ between those 2. And if there's a specific accommodation like phone calls that you can't receive, like as is this example, then you can include that in your reasonable accommodation request. And legally, they have to follow whatever you require. Next, payment standards. These are tricky. Payment standards are the maximum amount the voucher will pay for monthly gross rent. Monthly gross rent is rent plus utilities. So this means that these are like the monthly costs for your apartment. And these are determined by unit size. And additionally, for certain zip codes that are generally like a little more expensive than normal, there are exception payment standards, EPS, another acronym, which can be found here is on, when we send out the slides afterwards, all of these will actually be linked, but this will take you to HPD's website that explains the exception payment standards. And thank goodness payment standards are the same for both NYCHA and HPD. These are determined by the renting standards of the, like this, it just depends on the rental markets. And so these are kind of set every year, and there are these general payment standards. And so this chart here shows general payment standards for the vouchers. And then if you're looking at a specific zip code, that might be a little more expensive. The exception payment standards allow these prices to more accurately represent that local market. And so here is an example of exception payment standards for zip code 10001. I picked this because it was the very first one on the page. And you can see here that this is actually much, much higher because the rent in this area is very high. And with these vouchers, the NYCHA and HPD want you to be able to rent an apartment like anyone else and doesn't want and wants people to be able to rent in whichever neighborhood and area they are able to do and not be excluded from certain neighborhoods because it's so expensive. And so these exception payment standards really allow the vouchers to more accurately mirror the local markets. Continuing our example from before, we have the Smith family. Say they have a NYCHA administered emergency housing voucher, which means they have a unit size of 3. And here, if they have a unit size of 3, then their general payment standard would give them $3,385 a month for both rent and utilities. And then say the Smith family goes, you know, actually, we're going to look for an apartment in the zip code 10001. Now they're looking at $5,082 as the general amount that the voucher would cover for both rent and utilities. And so these are helpful when you're searching for apartments to know like what you can look for. What are the general areas of what are the prices of apartments are you looking for? But then, you know, if utilities are included, then your rent plus utilities should be somewhere around maybe a little less than the voucher payment standards that is applicable to that area. So I know that there are a lot of numbers up here, and we're going to get it even a little trickier with adding in the utility payments. But generally, these payment standards help you figure out, you know, where's your price point? If you're looking in this area, what kind of apartment should you be looking at? What kind of is the range of rent that you can be looking at for an apartment that your voucher will help you cover? I see that there are questions in the chat. And why don't they provide this to us when we have the voucher? They should, is the thing. And so these are really important resources to know when you have a voucher, how to search, how to know what your payment standards are, how to figure out what an exception payment standard is, where you're looking. They are generally included in the landlord packet. And when you're searching, you should have all of these resources, but I know that sometimes it can be really overwhelming or you don't get all of the resources that you should have. So I wanted to include all of this here, and these are all online as well. And these also do update. So, you know, next year after that, payment standards will probably change because the rental market is always changing. And unfortunately, New York always getting a little bit more expensive. So it's good to stay up to date with all of this. Any more questions?
Katie, there was a question in much earlier about income limits, right? So if you're earning an income, how does this payment standard either change?
So great question. Income limits are only really applicable for whether or not you're going to be like able to be continually eligible for the voucher. And if you have income, you can still have your voucher. It just, you can't have too high of an income where you can actually pay for, you know, all of your rent yourself. But yes, thank you, Sarah, for including that in the chat. But the income limits are generally set to like 50% of the annual median income. And so that will be like if an individual is making like more than $50,000, they might not be eligible to continually get the emergency housing voucher for the next year. with these payment standards, we're going to get into this in a little bit, what exactly you will be expected to pay, but your income limits aren't going to come into factor here. Thanks for that question. Next, utility allowances. So utility allowance is applied if the cost of utilities for a unit is not included in the rent, but is rather the responsibility of the tenant. So like, say for example, in my apartment here, we pay for electric and that is not included in our rent. So we would have a utility allowance. And this is important because your payment standards are not just for rent, but they're for rent and utilities. That's the gross rent. And so they must be subtracted from the payment standard in order to determine, what a reasonable rent could be. And the applicable utility allowances depend on household unit size and on which utilities the tenant is responsible for. So again, this is online. The utility allowance rates are different for cooking gas, for electric, for heating, for oil, gas, if you have that. And all of those can be found online. I just pulled one example table here of cooking gas and electric. And it does depend on the number of voucher or the number of bedrooms. And we're going to go back to the Smith family again. If they're renting at zip code 10001, they have a voucher unit size of 3, and their voucher payment standards for both rent and utilities is $5,000. Their voucher would have a utility allowance if they have to cover their cooking gas and electric. So we say they have a voucher size of 3, $171 here. And so they would have $171 kind of calculated, subtracted from their voucher payment standards. So that they have their $5,000-ish, and then they get subtracted like $200-ish. So that leaves them with $4,800 that they could probably be expected for the voucher to cover for rent, and then $200 for utilities. So how this works is if the tenant is getting the utility allowance, it doesn't mean that you are directly getting like paid by NYCHA or by HPD. They're subtracting that from your personal contribution. So then they're expecting that your personal contribution to rent and your personal contribution to utilities would total whatever we're going to calculate to be your personal contribution. So you're not going to get like a payment from NYCHA or from HPD for utilities, but they're going to lower the amount of rent that they would expect you to pay because that they're expecting you to pay that money towards the utility. Okay. So now,
Tamarata, I think Tamarata was trying to say something. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that because we usually run into rent reasonableness issues a lot, that I would tell at least we tell our clients, even if you find apartments that are at the payment standard or a little below, just to try to subtract, look at the utility allowance and try to subtract a certain amount of money. I can't get it at the top of my head right now, but if they tell you what's not included in the rent, try to subtract it yourself to see if you would be able to afford it or not. Because sometimes things, and then you can ask your case managers or housing navigators to also help you with that as well. But just to make sure, because it happens sometimes cases are being pushed through to NYCHA, and next thing you know, they have to negotiate the rent because we or even the landlord thought it would be okay to set the rent at a certain price, but after they realized that the allowances weren't taken account for, we weren't able to rent it to the client. So I would say even if you find apartments that are very close to the payment standard, make sure to try to see what you can subtract from it based on the utility allowance paperwork, so that you wouldn't face that issue when it's time. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you, Tamarata, for adding that in. That's a really good point. These are really important to include these income levels. So say we have the Smith family, they have a unit size of 3, they're renting in 10001, they have this $5,082 voucher payment standards. This does not necessarily mean that they can be going to an apartment with the rent of $5,000, because what if that apartment has utilities that the tenant is responsible for, that's going to bump it up past the voucher payment standard. So you need to know, it's important to know when you're searching, are the utilities included? What does that mean? How much are the utilities going to be? Which utilities are included, which aren't? And we're going to talk a little bit now about exactly what you can be expected to pay. So typically, you'll pay 30% of your monthly adjusted income towards rent and utilities. So again, that rent and utilities is the gross monthly rent. And your adjusted income is not necessarily what actually all of the money you are earning. So this is important because, you know, say with a paycheck or with your cash assistance, you're getting a certain amount of money. That is not necessarily what your monthly adjusted income is. Monthly adjusted income is the household's gross income plus cash value of any assets minus any exclusions and allowable deductions. And so these exclusions are things like SNAP. So if you're receiving food stamps, which is SNAP, those don't count towards your monthly adjusted income. If you're getting any one-time lump sum payments, any casual income, sporadic income, those don't count towards your monthly adjusted income. There's also deductions for each family member who is a minor or who has a disability. And so those are also important to take into account. So your monthly rent or your monthly income and your monthly adjusted income are not always the same thing, but you'll typically pay 30% of your monthly adjusted income to rent and utilities. You can rent an apartment with a gross rent that is slightly more than your voucher payment standards. So you have the voucher payment standard that you calculated, that you found for your unit size, for your family, and looking, you know, in whatever zip code that you're looking. And you can rent an apartment with a gross rent that is at or lower or a little bit higher. So this is where all that math comes into play, and where Tamarada's great point about the utility standards being really important, because there's a whole rent calculation sheet that I'll share to everyone's emails afterwards, but NYCHA HPD is going to be doing this math to figure out how much of your monthly adjusted income you'd be expected to pay. So typically it's 30%. But if there are any costs, if your rent and utilities would bring your costs over 30% of over the voucher payment standard cost, then you would be responsible for any extra costs beyond that. So say that my voucher payment standard is $2,000, but I found a apartment that I really like that has rent of $2,100, and then also I have a utility allowance of $100, and then so that brings up the total monthly gross to $2,200, whereas my voucher payment standard is only $2,000. That's a difference. And so I, as a person who'd be renting, would be responsible for paying that entire difference. So you can rent a little bit beyond the voucher payment standard, but NYCHA and HPD will not let you rent a place where your personal contribution, which is 30% of your adjusted income plus whatever's over the voucher payment standard, if that total cost would be more than 40% of your adjusted income, you won't be allowed to rent that. So that's what the 40% rule is. NYCHA and HPD don't want you paying more than 40% of your adjusted monthly income towards rent and utilities. And then finally, the tenant share portion of the rent may be higher if some people in your family don't have an eligible immigration status. So if your family has mixed immigration statuses, and I mean that with this voucher, they're like citizens are eligible, but there are also eligible non-citizens. So there are eligible immigration statuses, and if everyone in your family has an eligible immigration status, then all of the math and stuff that we'll be doing, that's normal. That's what the case is. However, if you have any members of your family who have an immigration status that is not eligible to receive public or federal housing assistance, then your family would receive a prorated amount of assistance based off of the percentage of your household that is actually eligible with immigration guidelines. And I am looking at Joy's question in the chat. How do we resolve utility conflicts? Clients that were said to owe a large amount because the landlord had a meter set incorrectly. Wonderful, wonderful question. And we are going to talk about that in housing rights. But thanks for bringing that up, because that is actually a very common thing where we're talking about utility problems, questions with that, like shared metering, things that are brought up incorrectly. But that is a great question that we will definitely talk on later. Okay. Any questions here about payment standards, what I would pay? Thank you very much. I know that this math is messy, but we'll be sharing these slides after. I'll share a rent calculation guide, but I just want to have, these numbers and these concepts out, and we're talking about them and what that might actually look like. Okay. Now, we know that there are a million gazillion questions that you can be asking about your housing voucher. And so we want to have resources that people can go to. It's amazing if you have a case manager, someone who you feel like you can trust, who knows a lot about this program, but not everyone has that. And it's also important to know that you have places and resources that you can go to yourself to ask questions, to learn more information. So almost all of the information that I got today was off of websites online, and I will share all of that with you from NYCHA, from HPD, from the city government. We also have housing navigators. Tamarata runs one of the housing navigation programs, and they are amazing. They are a great source of support and income. They know more about this program than I do by a lot. And housing navigators generally are contracted by the city as a community-based organization. So for example, like New Destiny is one community-based organization that's been contracted by the city to have a housing navigator program. Tamarata has another housing navigation program, and they have two different goals. And I'm trying to find this here. So one of the important goals of housing navigators is to explain voucher payment standards and utilities, allowances, and things like this, because we know that this math is hard. It took me a while to figure out, and I know that clients are like, it's tricky, it's hard, it's not easy math. So having a housing navigator help explain this whole process, show the standards, what are exception payment standards, what are the different, what are the charts, what are the guidelines, what's the math that we're doing here, they help with that. Housing navigators will help you figure out this whole EHV process from when you get your voucher to all the way until you're safely in your apartment. So helping with that whole leasing process, the support, finding an apartment, things like that.
Okay, there is a question in the Q&A. Could you explain the relationship between the gross pay and net pay when it comes to getting a job, and the annual being $48,200?
Okay,
And how
so
does it affect the voucher? Yeah.
that's a great question. So it's gonna start with like how much money is your family actually earning, and that's your family's income. But then when I'm talking about here earlier, with the monthly adjusted income, so we're looking at like monthly, what are you earning? What's your paycheck? If you're getting cash assistance, what is that? If you're getting Social Security, what is that? Child support, any basic like consistent payments that are coming in, that's your monthly income. But then when you're doing the adjustments, that's when you like SNAP doesn't count towards that. One time, like lump sum, anything casual, those don't count. And then there's also deductions for, say you have a kid living with you have someone with a disability, those will deduct from your income. So you have your net income versus your gross income, and then when you're doing the adjustments, that is when you're also going to take out these deductions. I hope that answers the question. But even looking at this, like an annual take home of, good question in the chat, why does Social Security count and not SNAP? So SNAP is because they're counting that as like food stamps, like that one does not count. I don't know exactly how they're making all these determinations, but because it's the food, they don't count that. Okay, so questions about your voucher. As we were saying, Housing Navigators, amazing source of support, information as you're going through this process. And contacting public housing agencies is also another option. So if you have a NYCHA administered voucher, contact NYCHA. If you have an HPD administered voucher, contact HPD. These are the phone numbers. NYCHA also has walk-in centers. HPD, they have different emails for like each different question topic. So there's like a portability email. There's one that if you have questions about recertification, those go to that email. If you have questions about an income decrease or about inspections, like those all go to different emails. The list is here. The list is also online. But those, you can also contact your public housing agencies at any time with questions about your voucher.
There is also a question in the Q&A. Is it, if it's you who has the disability, does it impact your portion?
Good question. I'm trying to think about this, but if you have the disability, you are probably, I do not think so. Because generally, if you have a disability, if your SSI or Social Security is your only like source of income at that point, which is largely the case if you like are receiving disability for yourself, then that is like one of your main sources of income, then that is not going to be counting towards. I do not believe. And there's a question also in the chat. So once your aftercare is up, you go to NYCHA for help. Yes, absolutely. There may be some other resources and people you can go to. But NYCHA, if you have a NYCHA administered voucher, or HPD, if you have an HPD administered voucher, are great sources of support and help for that. Now, housing rights. So this is such a big topic. We have 4 slides about it. So to start, your lease is a contract between you and your property owner. And this has the terms and conditions of the rental. And you are protected. Well, you have all of the protections that are listed in your lease. And this is binding and can only be adjusted with a written adjustment that is signed by both you and the landlord. And so it's really important to know what is in your lease to be able to figure out, what are my rights dealing with this? What responsibilities do I have as a tenant? That's all in your lease. So it's really important to know that. You are also protected by law from harassment and discrimination. And so harassment is any act or omission by or on behalf of an owner that causes or is intended to cause a tenant to surrender or waive any rights in relation to the occupancy of their unit. So this means, like, if your landlord is refusing to make repairs in your building, withholding essential services in order to try and force you to move out of your apartment, that would be an example of harassment. And if you think that there are any cases of harassment or discrimination, calling 311 is a great option. There is an anti-harassment unit within that. There are a lot of great tenant resources. I also did just find out that we are running a little bit shorter on time because there are so many questions, and I love that there are so many questions, but we're going to now hold those till the end. Thank you. Housing rights part 2. Your property owners who receive a monthly EHV subsidy, and they have to follow requirements along like as a part of participating in this EHV program. And these requirements include periodic public space and unit inspections and the prompt repair of any violations from these inspections. And so these inspections are called HQS inspections, they're housing quality standard. And when they're doing an HQS inspection, this has like a big checklist of things that they're going through, checking off, do you have this, do you have this, do you have this? And so property owners have to have a place that will, you know, satisfy all of the requirements of the HQS inspection. And then if anything is found to be wrong, if there are any violations of the HQS found during the HQS inspection, they have to fix that quickly. Additionally, if you're living in a rent stabilized apartment, you have the right to a lease renewal at the end of your release term and succession rights for qualifying family members. If you're in housing courts, for any reason, including eviction, you have the right to legal representation. Again, calling 311 to learn more about your housing rights is a really great opportunity. And if you are facing eviction for any reason, the only legal way to evict a non-paying tenant is through a non-payment eviction proceeding in court. So trying to just lock you out of your building or change the locks, that's not legal. They can't do that. They can't just remove your stuff. The only legal way to evict a non-paying tenant is through these proceedings in court. So it's really important to know your housing rights, especially when it comes about eviction. And now going to kind of Joy's point, you should expect to live in a safe, well-maintained building free from vermin, leaks, and hazardous conditions. If conditions in your building are not safe, or need repairs, or you have any concerns, including about, oh, I think my meter for my electric is being shared, I don't think it's set up correctly. What do I do if I have these concerns? First, notify the building owner or manager of any maintenance problems. So it's really important that you know who you can communicate with and ask them, explain what the problem is, ask them if they can fix it. If verbal notification does not result in a resolution to a problem, tenants may wish to send a written notification. And you can do this through certified mail with a return receipt requested in order to have it be like really official, and so it can be proven later in court if necessary. But you want to have it proven that you went to the building owner or manager about this problem and have that like written and provable in order to go about finding a solution to this problem. Next, you can also always file complaints with the city by calling 311. This will open a complaint, and then there will be an inspection. They'll do a little investigation, and then after a little while, they'll reach out to your property manager or owner about this concern. HPD will try and call you back to make sure that it was fixed. If not, then they'll do investigations, and there can be the building owner or manager can face repercussions if they don't fix a problem that was found to be wrong. Additionally, as an EHV participant, you have the right to request more HQS inspections, more housing quality standard inspections from NYCHA HPD if you think that the place you're living in does not meet the housing quality standards that are set by NYCHA and HPD. So they can send out an inspector to conduct this inspection. And then, as we said earlier, your landlord is required to promptly repair any violations that are found. So tenants in privately owned buildings who have apartment maintenance problems or who have been harassed may also then escalate and initiate legal action in housing court. So these are kind of like the steps of escalation. If you have a maintenance repair, if you need a repair, if you need something to be fixed, you have questions, you have shared metering concerns, this is kind of the steps along which you can go. And if you have any more questions about your housing rights, you can call 311, ask for the tenant helpline, the ABCs of housing, which I'll be sending out to everyone's email after the presentation, has it's like a 30-page booklet that goes all about housing rights, owners' rights, tenants' rights, And I know Tamarada also put in the chat that Mobilization for Justice is also a good resource in addition to reaching out to 311. Yes, there's a lot of great organizations that work with housing rights. Now, final topic, recertification. Recertification is, there are two different kind of parts to recertification. There's an annual recertification and an interim recertification. Annual recertification, all EHV voucher holders are required to do every year. And this basically just, they're checking in, what's your income? What's the situation like? Are you paying the right amount? Are you still eligible for the program? How is everything going? All voucher holders have to do this every year. And in addition, if there are any changes that happen between your annual recertification periods, such as like a change in household composition, you know, I had a baby, need to add them to the voucher, or maybe I lost my job, or I went from full-time to part-time, there's a change in my household income or assets. These are all things that you can do an interim recertification for between the time periods when you're doing annual recertifications. And this is especially important if there's a significant decrease in income that's going to change what your household is able to pay. So first, we're going to go through annual recertifications. We're going to go through these for NYCHA versus HPD because the process differs between the public housing agencies. So first, for NYCHA annual recertification, you will be notified via either mail or email 5 months before everything is due. And this notice that you'll get from NYCHA is going to tell you to log on to your NYCHA self-service portal. And on your NYCHA self-service portal, it'll tell you to do your online annual recertification. And once you've gotten this notice, you're like, okay, now I have to do my annual recertification. I have to do it in the self-service portal. You're going to go in the self-service portal. There is an annual recertification. There's a little button for that on your self-service portal. Once you've gone into your case, it will tell you, it'll have all of the forms you need to fill out. You're going to need to fill all of those out accurately and completely and upload all required documentation. So every time you're putting in information, you'll need to upload supporting documentation. You do all of this within the self-service portal. You're supposed to do all of this within 30 days of receiving your online recertification notice. So everything is done online for NYCHA. Then NYCHA is going to review and verify all of this information. And if they need more information, that's going to be in your portal. And so, you can check in your portal once you've submitted everything. It'll be like, okay, it's all under review. But then if they need more documents, that will be shown in your portal. So then maybe you need to upload more documents. Maybe you need to add a little more information. But that will all be in your portal. Once everything is approved, you'll get a voucher change notice that indicates the amount of monthly rent that you are responsible for and what is the NYCHA portion of the rent and when is this happening. If you have any questions about your NYCHA recertification, you can call their customer contact center or visit a walk-in center, and they can help you with your recertification process. Now, HPD. They are going acoustic. They are not doing this online. They will notify EHV participants via mail 4 months before all forms are due. You are going to get a thick packet in the mail with all of the forms that are required, and it'll have information about how to submit it. And so notice that there is a time difference, 5 months versus 4 months. And with NYCHA, everything is online. With HPD, everything is paper. And you will fill out this whole packet accurately and completely, and then submit it along with all of the documentation. And you can submit it either to a portal online, you can email it, or you can mail it. I would recommend that you don't just mail it off into the abyss as your only copy, but you also scan and take pictures, or email it and mail it, or make a copy and then just mail off one of the copies. So it's important to, not just send things off like that.
I would add too that anytime you're mailing something, to try to get it certified mail return receipt.
Yes, that's a great point. Thanks for adding that, Sarah. Yeah. It's good to know that when you send something, it's been received, and to be able to prove that is really important. So once HPD has received all of your documentation, they'll give you a rent breakdown letter that indicates the amount of monthly rent that the participant is responsible for, and that their HPD, sorry, this should say HPD, not NYCHA, that they're responsible for, as well as the effective date of any change. If you have any questions about this, you can email either one of these emails, or you can call HPD for help filling out your forms. They also do have like recertification, how to fill out your recertification forms online. Next, interim recertifications, as I mentioned briefly, these are just whenever you have any changes that are happening between your annual recertification, you can report these in order to, maybe change the amount that your family is contributing, but also letting them know if any changes are happening. With NYCHA, again, it's all in the self-service portal. You can do interim recertification. That's its own button. Click that, you start it, you fill it all out, and you upload any supporting documentation. With HPD, again, it's all paper, but there are forms for this, and the forms are all online. And there's forms to report income decreases and forms to report changes in household composition. And you can email those forms to HPD, or you can also mail them in or fax them, but we generally recommend emailing. Now, a few frequently asked questions that I want us to touch on briefly. How can someone apply for an EHV? I know we talked about this earlier, but the applications are closed. So no more EHV applications are being accepted as of September 22. Can I change which public housing agency administers my voucher? No. Short answer, no. What happens if my family has members who do not have eligible immigration status? This is going to affect your family's contribution. You need to have at least one person in your family who does have eligible immigration status for federal assistance, but if not all members of your family do, then they're going to prorate your family's assistance based off of the percentage of your family members who are eligible. And how can I learn more about transfers, portability, and moving? My next webinar.